Why isn't Donald Trump coming tomorrow? Because he has a 4-year-old mentality, and he's having a tantrum. He's having a tantrum. What is the tantrum? That the rest of the world says, we don't want a king. As President Lula said, we don't need an emperor. He would come here as just one of 20 leaders, or 21. He doesn't want that. He's having a tantrum. So this rebalancing is happening. He's having a particular tantrum, by the way, because the United States is in a deeply neurotic funk. You know what the cause of that neurosis is? China. A wonderful, brilliant civilization, 4,000 years old plus. It's been a unified state with brilliant statecraft for more than 2,000 years. Unlike Europe, in which every country of Europe fought every other country of Europe every year for 1,000 years. Most of the time, China was peaceful, united. It fragmented temporarily at some points, but it was mainly a unified country that actually, strangely enough, didn't beat up its neighbors also. So China, for 1,000 years, never attacked Japan, for example. Can you imagine? Britain couldn't keep its hands off any place for more than a year or two at a time. It had to go beat up somebody. And the United States doesn't even take a year off. I don't know the truth yet. It could be an accident, but I don't think so. Today, a major refinery in Venezuela suddenly exploded. That seems a lot like the CIA to me. I don't guarantee it. We don't have any more news. But last week, President Trump said he had assigned the CIA to operations inside Venezuela, and a week later, suddenly the biggest refinery blows up. So the United States can hardly go a week at a time without trying to kill somebody. But China actually goes centuries without attacking its neighbors. So China went for 1,000 years without once invading Japan, a near neighbor, even though China was much more powerful. Incidentally, from 2 times, there was an attempt to invade Japan from the Chinese mainland, but that was when China had been conquered by the Mongols. So 800 years ago, roughly, they tried twice. The Mongols tried to invade Japan, and they were defeated both times. But the Chinese never tried. The Japanese actually, sadly, invaded China many times, but never the other way around. And the Chinese never invaded Korea. And the Chinese did invade Vietnam once, but that was 615 years ago. And then they had a skirmish for 1 month in 1979. Other than that, that's the so-called enemy of the United States. So that's why I call it a neurosis. China's the least threat possible. Doesn't threaten anybody. Doesn't attack anybody. Hasn't been in any war for 46 years, and the war that it was in 46 years ago lasted 1 month. That's when Vietnam toppled a government in Cambodia that China viewed as an ally, and so it punished Vietnam for a month. for having overthrown their ally in Cambodia. Other than that, no wars for more than 4 decades. But we're in a funk because the American idea is you have to be number one so you can boss everyone else around. And by the way, we learned every trick we know from the British, who did that for 200 years before that. So that's where the geopolitics comes in. What Adam Smith is saying in 1776 is we need to look forward to a future in which there is equal force, mutual respect, social justice. And we're at that hinge moment of history because, to my way of thinking, we are at the end of 3 major cycles. First, with these momentous discoveries that Adam Smith talked about, these sea routes that the Europeans found, that began a period of European ascent in the world history and world economy, because Europe was nothing special economically or geopolitically in 1500. You would not put it as likely to succeed or to dominate. But those events changed the course of events. Then in 1750 and really in 1776, oddly enough, the same year that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, a very skilled engineer, we would say today, but he didn't have that title, a man named James Watt, working at the University of Glasgow, fittingly at a university, stuck a condenser on a steam engine that had been invented decades before, and suddenly the steam engine became incredibly efficient, low cost, and suddenly the industrial age was feasible because of that great invention of the steam engine. That happened, that commercial steam engine of James Watt, which is why we talk about megawatts today, because of Mr. Watt and the power that his steam engine brought. That came in 1776, and Britain was the first country to industrialize, and it really did beat up the rest of the world after that, because the industrialization, the power that came with that, the industrial military led to a worldwide imperialism that dominated the 19th and the first part of the 20th century. And at its apogee, the British Empire had 1/4 of all the people in the world under British imperial domination. Of course, India was a big part of that 25% of humanity. So that's a second part of a cycle. And then, because Europe has a very hard time making peace within Europe. It's really a sickness, actually, I'm sorry to say. We love Europe. My wife's born in Europe. My family comes from Europe. But they fight each other so much. Not my wife and me, but every 2 countries bear a grudge. Yesterday, I was texting with a friend of mine who wrote to me because he was giving a lecture in Poland, in Warsaw. And I said, yes, it's so sad, the hatred of Russia in Poland. And he said, oh, but remember what Russia did. And he said, you have to remember, in 1792, that's what he wrote. And I wrote, get over it. You don't have to fight every time, because in 1792, you fought because the Russians would say, yeah, 1792, but in 1610, you invaded us. And that's true, by the way. Poland started it. When Russia was in trouble, in so-called times of trouble in 1610, it was Poland that invaded Russia. Then Russia invaded Poland 150 years later, and on, and they can't stop. And there is, by the way, there's the famous saying of the philosopher George Santayana, the Spanish philosopher of the 20th century, that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. And my wife has a better one, though. Sonia says those who remember history are condemned to repeat it, because all you do is you bear a grudge for 1,000 years. Get over it. So I think that so I was going to say Europe destroyed itself in 2 civil wars, which we call World War I and World War II. And by the end of the Second World War, Europe was so broken that decolonization came. Not, by the way, because it was inevitable had there not been the wars, but Britain was bankrupt at the end of 1945, after 2 world wars. And Europe had lost any claim whatsoever, not that it deserved it ever, but any claim that it was a civilizing mission or anything else. Not only was it a completely reckless and cruel incivility of the imperial age, but they couldn't even within Europe behave with any decency and slaughtered tens of millions of people. So at the end of World War II, imperialism wasn't quite over, though. Europe lost its colonies step by step. Sometimes there were wars of decolonization in Africa. Sometimes it went more quickly and somewhat peacefully. It all depended. But there was one more empire that was going to stand, and that was the United States empire, because the U.S. became a world empire, and not only a world empire in 1945, and again, having learned the tricks of the trade from Britain, it was a world empire that aspired to dominate the world. And the policy of the United States was there should be no rival. So this was not quite possible because one major power, the Soviet Union itself, did not want to be dominated by the United States. And rather than making peace between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which were allies in World War II, remember that, they were allies. The U.S. and Britain said, we're enemies of our ally, the one that had actually broken the back of Hitler's army, because the Soviet people lost 27 million in World War II. They bore the brunt of World War II. They defeated Hitler, but the U.S. and Britain did not know how to make peace. They said the Soviet Union's the new enemy, and a Cold War emerged. And I put a lot of the responsibility on the U.S. side for this, because what Russia or the Soviet Union wanted was for Germany to be demilitarized and neutral. And the United States said, no, Germany will be remilitarized and part of our new military alliance, NATO. And the Soviet Union said, now you're a threat to us again. And that led to decades of Cold War. So we lost what could have been the peace. But the United States saw the Soviet Union as, of course, the enemy. The Soviet economic system was not so great, and the U.S. was out to break it in any event through controls on technology and isolation, containment it was called. And as of 1991, the Soviet Union had an economic collapse, and it collapsed into 15 successor states. And I mention this because at that moment, the United States said, oh my God, now we made it. We're alone. We run the world. And believe me, that's how they felt. And that was an illusion, a delusion. They thought Russia, that's a nothing. And they thought China, don't they grow rice there? That's an impoverished country of villages. We don't even have to worry about that. We are the sole superpower of the world. Well, that's not how economics works, actually, because Adam Smith's insight is completely right, which is that if you are fortunate to have open trade, peace, and good economic policies, you get a lot of catching up by the transmission of knowledge, technology, and the opportunities for rapid advance. So while the United States wasn't watching, and I know they weren't watching because they're not very clever there in Washington, I have to tell you, and they don't understand much of economics at all. They weren't paying attention, but China was growing at 10% per year, thank you. And if you do that, you double the size of your economy every 7 years. And if you do that for 35 years, which China did, you've doubled 5 times. And doubling 5 times means you've grown 32 times. And if you continue beyond that, China has increased the size of its economy 40 times since 1980. 40 times. It's now a bigger economy than the United States. It's a much bigger industrial power. It is technologically more advanced than the United States in most sectors, not all, but in most sectors right now. When you drive your vehicles 10 years from now, they will be Chinese electric vehicles. And even if you happen to drive a Tesla, that's a Chinese vehicle, by the way, with Elon Musk at the top. But it's the gigafactory in Shanghai that gives it even a chance to compete. So China made it, and that's why we're at the end of yet another cycle. The European imperial age is over. The British imperial age ended in 1945, and the U.S. imperial age is ending right now. And that's why Donald Trump is home, because he doesn't want to be one of several. That's all. The delusion is still in Washington, by the way. It's not over. It's still a powerful country. It's still a dangerous country. It's got too big a military. It still has its hands on the valves of the international payment system to a large extent. It can turn on and off the spigot for countries that are vulnerable. Remember, the IMF and the World Bank are U.S. institutions, even though they are multilateral institutions. They were founded for not bad purposes, by the way, but they are American-dominated institutions, and that gives continuing power. And I always emphasize geography in thinking about economics. So the geography is that at Pennsylvania Avenue, which is where the White House is, now there's a West Wing and no East Wing because he knocked it down a couple weeks ago, this idiot. Excuse me. Sorry. It's true. I'm just being technical. At 16th in Pennsylvania is the White House. 15th in Pennsylvania is the Treasury Building. 17th in Pennsylvania is what's called the Executive Office of the President of the U.S. 18th in Pennsylvania is the World Bank. And 19th in Pennsylvania is the International Monetary Fund. So it's only 2 blocks from the president's office to tell the IMF what to do. You don't even need to text it. It takes 30 seconds to walk across the street to say, veto that country's program. And that's still power. But it's power that is fading. It's fading in part because of the BRICS. Because the BRICS are saying, we don't need to be under the thumb of a U.S. empire. That's what President Lula said when he was hosting the BRICS this summer, and Trump put on a tariff on Brazil because he didn't like a court proceeding against the preceding president who had tried to make a coup. And so he put on a penalty tariff, and President Lula said, we don't need an emperor, and we're not going to succumb to this kind of pressure. So the BRICS, of which you are an esteemed member, the S in BRICS, remember the 10 BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Egypt and Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Indonesia. The 10 BRICS countries have 46% of the world population. Thank you. And 41% of the world GDP. And they can look at the G7 and say, who are you? And that's what they're doing. So this is the new phase of geopolitics. The world is not falling apart, but the U.S. and Europe are having a tantrum. That's different. And the world is not fragmenting. The U.S. is isolating itself. It doesn't even go to the parties anymore. It puts on tariffs. It says, you can't have our market. And the rest of the world says, okay, because your market's not so important for us. And Trump said, okay, we're going to punish you, China, for being so successful, by the way. We're going to put 100% tariff on you. And the next hour, China said, okay, we're putting 120% tariff on you. And then Trump said, okay, we're going to restrict any advanced chips going to you. And China said, okay, no rare earth magnets. And the U.S. within a half an hour said, we surrender. By the way, I had no idea there was anything called a rare earth magnet before all of this happened. So I had to ask ChatGPT what it was exactly. It turns out it's absolutely essential for all manufacturing, for automotive, for military, and so on. And China makes them. The U.S. doesn't make them. And so turned out the U.S. learned a bit of a lesson there. Again, yet another reason why Donald Trump is staying home. So this is why we're at such a historic juncture. But the world is really not fragmenting. It's remaining open and it's trading. It's just that one corner of the world is very surly. The part that used to dominate just can't figure out what's going on. And Trump is, of course, trying to flex the military muscles in a disgusting way. The U.S. is still militarily powerful, no doubt about it. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza are imperial wars. The war in Ukraine came because the United States said after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we'll move all our military bases up to the Russian border. And by the way, in 1990, when Germany was reunifying and President Gorbachev was president still of the Soviet Union, the United States promised President Gorbachev, if you, the Soviet Union, agree to the reunification of Germany, which had been divided after World War II in the Cold War, and required the Soviet approval because that was how World War II ended by treaty in 1990. The only real treaty that ended World War II was in 1990. They needed the Soviet agreement. And to get the Soviet agreement, the United States said to President Gorbachev, we promise NATO won't move 1 inch eastward. Not 1 inch. And if you want all the documentary record of that, go to a website called National Security Archive of George Washington University, and go to a website that is called What Gorbachev Heard, and you'll find 42 documents or so that say all of what I just said, that the U.S. promised NATO would never enlarge. But as soon as the Soviet Union ended and the United States said, we're all alone in this, then they started exactly what they promised they wouldn't do, which was eastward enlargement of NATO. And that's why there's the war in Ukraine. It's a disgrace. And it is killing the Ukrainians. And it is part of the famous adage of Henry Kissinger, which you may recall, that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. Ukraine said, we'll be a friend, and now they're dying because of that. Because they said, okay, NATO enlarged. The United States said, we have your back. And probably 2 million Ukrainians have been killed or gravely wounded in this completely unnecessary and reckless war. And the United States is doing the same with Israel in Gaza. And let me thank you, South Africa, for standing up for justice. It was very brave, very right, very precise to launch the International Court of Justice case on Israel's violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. The ICJ takes too long to rule, but the evidence that South Africa brought on behalf of the whole world is absolutely right and compelling.